what led you to get into the field of fire or fuels management?
Yeah, that's not one of those straightforward questions for me to answer because it's a part of my life experience path that I was on. I mean, now it's the bread and butter of my work, and it's hard to imagine my life without it. But if you would ask me, when I was a kid growing up on the Mackenzie River, what was my focus? It was actually just more on forestry and forest management, even though I actually didn't see myself going into that kind of work or that field. I grew up around industrial forest management, alongside small family woodland management. So I was always fascinated by the two different ways of doing forestry work. And it wasn't until I was actually in my late years of high school and early years of college that, because my dad had made an interesting shift from working as a millwright in the logging industry to manufacturing firefighting equipment, which I think is actually kind of an interesting and telling example of what happened in the Pacific Northwest. Because, I grew up in the middle of the timber wars. And, when I was going to school in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was this overlap between forest management and fire started happening. And locally that had to do with the Warner Creek salvage logging and the protests that occurred as part of that. And a lot of what is referred to as eco-terrorism was coming out of that. And so there was some fire connection there that didn't quite hook me at that point. It was really about my dad's work and how all of a sudden I was paying attention to fire because of what he was doing. And I didn't enter into it originally with a mission, if you will. It was more like, I'm in college and I need work in the summer that's going to be interesting and pay well to help me get through the rest of the year, when I wasn't working as much. So initially in 1999, I got onto a contract hand crew based in Springfield. And, I was like one of the only people who had a valid driver's license. So I was one of the drivers. That was the kind of folks and I mean, I was like, not like that, I hadn't gotten in any trouble at all. And so, that was my, my sort of introduction to that world. And I was a philosophy student at the time. So I was more interested in, wow, what does this mean? What is there an analogy here for human life? Is this disturbance needed? Is it natural? Is this good or not? And even some of those people that didn't have driver's licenses had an idea about that. So they were the ones teaching me everything from, you see that limb up there hanging from the tree, that's only 50 feet up and as big as your arm, that, if that hit you in the head without your hard hat, that could kill you. It's like, whoa, yeah, okay. Everything from that to, these forests need fire and we shouldn't be putting it out like this. And we're all firefighters. And I was like, wow, this is really interesting. But I didn't, at that point, it hadn't completely hooked me until I went without it. And so it was 99, 2000. I wanted to finish up my degree because I'd been sort of changing majors enough that until I figured out what I wanted to do, I wasn't sinking in. So it took me like 5.5 years to get my undergrad. And I took 2000 off to do an accelerated Spanish class. And that was 2000 has been dwarfed by all the years since in fire. But in that time frame, it was a big deal. It started the National Fire Plan. It started one of the biggest hiring surges we've ever seen in fire management. So many new hotshot cruisers stood up that don't exist now because the funding, didn't continue. So, so I came in during that time. Fuels positions were being funded well. Fire use was still a thing. And it was actually a really dynamic environment to get my foot in the door. So I went back in 2001 and I didn't initially get in under the National Fire Plan. I was just a temp working for the BLM out of Miles City in eastern Montana. I worked on the border of Montana and South Dakota and shortgrass prairie and pine upland fires. Really, really great experience. And that was when I was like, okay, this is so cool. I want to be around fire. I want to do this. And we're fighting a losing battle. And I want to be on the winning side, which is fuels management, prescribed fire. use the same element that needs to be here under controlled and predicted conditions to do good, because I could see bad things happening and good things happening all the time on fires, and some of the bad was from suppression damage, and some of the bad was from, fire effects that were probably outside, what were, I know this is really debatable to say this, but things that just seemed a little much. Okay. And especially when you're talking about like West Side, old growth forests and things like that. So I made a choice early on. I was going to get into fuels, but I didn't want to, start lighting fires until I could really get good at fighting them. And so I spent my first 8 years in suppression before I transitioned over to fuels, and worked my way up through from a fuels technician on the Willamette to a fuels tech on the Sisters Ranger District. Then did a temporary assignment as a fuels AFMO on the Ochoco and the Crooked River National Grassland. I kind of took a little side channel to do invasives work for a while, but I kept doing prescribed fire work and fighting fire while I was doing the invasives program management work, as well as post-fire emergency stabilization and rehab. But everything, continually came back to the same thing, which was lighting fires was the thing that I liked to do, that I was good at, that I had the, the head, the heart, the hands, everything. And I also had a spiritual, connection to the work, because it's caring and tending things that I feel like we're gifted, as humans on earth, and repairing relationships between people and their environments, which can be really harmed by wildfires. I consistently see, so that's basically all the things that sort of have accumulated to continue to keep me here. But it's hard to say, like, what was the one point that was like, aha. I mean, yeah, it was very, like I said, it was early on. And I mean, really what it was I was chasing down as much fire as I could see, and I really wanted to get out on burns. And so, getting into places where they were doing burning, that's the biggest reason I went to the Sisters Ranger District to work, because I knew they burned a lot, and that's what I wanted to do, was just do that more than fight fire. That was always my goal, burn more than fight fire. And I've definitely accomplished that. But there was years there where, yeah, I was definitely doing a lot of firefighting and more than burning, for sure. But that was, that's the agency work. I got into the Forest Service in a permanent job through the apprenticeship program. And that was another reason why I got exposed to a lot of that stuff, because the apprenticeship is a sort of holistic approach to getting in, that early training and experience together. And so, like, if you're coming from University of Idaho and you have the education piece, through a program like this, then you go get a good immersive training and experiential program like the apprenticeship, where they have it structured to send you to all these different opportunities and trainings, so that you don't have to wait for your chance, because there's a lot of there can be competition about how to get training and how to advance. And so when you get an apprenticeship position, you sort of just get bumped up automatically. So I did that too, and that was in 2002. So early in my career, I got into that apprenticeship program in Montana, and I got a ton of good experience. I also left before I finished because I got a permanent job, and that happens to a lot of people too. They will get a couple years in, and then what they call demo out, or as long as you stay at least at that point in time, as long as you stayed a permanent employee of the Forest Service, and all that time and training that they had put money into, because they put, $10,000+ into folks in those first couple of years, in addition to paying them salary and everything else. So yeah, that was huge. But I mean, there's like multiple things that led me to where I'm at. And certainly the apprenticeship was one. Getting a permanent fuels job on a busy district like Sisters, with all the complexities you can imagine, burning in the wildland urban interface with complicated smoke issues and lots of volatile fuels on busy highways with flaggers and pilot cars and lots of type 1 burning, all that stuff. That was huge. Leaving that to go work for the Nature Conservancy to manage their fire program, another big jump for me. So challenging, so exposed in terms of the things I got to experience. They were totally different than the Forest Service. And then I did a brief period of time at OSU, and in their extension program, and I was a regional fire specialist. So I got a good experience with a land grant university and what's it like to work in academia. And then I decided to go, well, and I started a prescribed fire council, and that kept me also augured into prescribed fire work. I did that here in Oregon and have chaired that council a couple times. And I worked with a lot of people on starting that. It wasn't just me. And if, in fact, it was more like I stuck with it when I started it, even though it was kind of miserable because I didn't have a lot of company and we were just fledgling, and it felt like, wow, is this ever going to work? And now it's been like launched out. I have no control over it. Gets funded through the Forest Service. And, so some, a lot of it was like prescribed fire is not always the best paying work, and it's not always the most well supported, but if you believe in it, like I always have, I've always known it was the thing to do, the right thing. Then I've just stuck it out through all these ups and downs, but I've also been really fortunate to land in some good places where I got lots of opportunities to learn and grow, which then allowed me to turn around and give back and help other people and do stuff like start the council, which wasn't always the funnest thing, but now it's really fun to watch because I don't have to do all the work. Yeah, so anyways, that's like way more probably than what you were asking, but we got plenty of time, so I figured I'd just go ahead and ramble. I'm good for that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it worked into the second question a little bit, but I liked hearing about how, especially you started this as a philosophy major. It's always so interesting to hear how people begin. Some people begin with like, yeah, I want to do this as a. They know they want to be out in the woods, and but to have it start as a philosophy, I think people often end that way, where they end more philosophical than they ever intended to be. I also really liked, yeah, I mean, and we'll hear about this a little bit more, I think, in these other questions, but just this communication, the way that you approach this with the care and the love and the connection to more than just a paycheck. I think that that's a really important thing to hit on, is that if you wanted a paycheck, then that, yes, it's, especially as a seasonal employee, when you're going from working at fast food place to this job, it's amazing. But then, when you start to try and have it be the main income, it's, there, you could do other things that could make you more money, but that's not what this is about. So that transitioning, and then your current position, tell us a little bit about the position that you're in now.
Yeah, it's kind of that's a really interesting journey because it started actually around the same time I got started in fire, and independent of me, nothing to do with me. But certified burn manager programs, which are for non-federal burners, and there's about 15 of them, I think, nationwide now. And they started in the Southeast, primarily as a way to provide private landowners with training and certification and some some alleviation of liability for maintenance, of their lands with fire. And some folks had lobbied the legislature to authorize such a program here in Oregon. But the language in the bill really just said ODF may stand up a program like this, but it didn't say they shall. And so the Prescribed Fire Council and the Nature Conservancy and Sustainable Northwest partnered to work with a couple of our representatives, a senator and a representative here in Oregon, to sponsor a bill that would essentially say, ODF, you're going to do this. And you're also going to legalize cross-boundary burning, because the state law in Oregon had previously not acknowledged that if you had a wildfire across the land ownership boundary, it was, or any fire, it could be a prescribed fire. If it crossed the land ownership boundary, it was considered a wildfire, and there was no way around that. So we had to fix that. And those were combined into one bill. And so it ended up being passed under our omnibus wildfire bill. And a part of that was a fiscal ask for a position to run that program. And so it was not my intent when I was, testifying on those bills to, get a job out of it. I had no thoughts around that, but then they flew the position, and I thought, you know, as someone who came up through their career as a practitioner through and through, you know, I've participated in research projects here and there and stuff, but I'm not an academic, you know. And that's where I was. I was an assistant professor of practice at OSU Extension's fire program. And but I really wanted to get back in that saddle of being more directly involved, you know, even if it was just in policy and program administration, to like fire hitting the ground. And so I applied for that job and got it. And it's been a really great experience for me to be able to work on a program with Heather, no less. She's been really helpful to us in designing our instructional guide, which is going to be used for development of curricular content by our training providers. And so the whole program has been, it's been governed by rules. And I was on the advisory committee for that rulemaking prior to becoming an ODF employee. So I got to influence some of that before I came to work for ODF, and then have been carrying out those roles since, as well as working on internal policy and helping ODF firefighters retool to become practitioners of prescribed fire through various methods. I mean, some of it's just helping them get training and on burns and, you know, that kind of thing. And some of it's trying to bring money in through grants to set up learn and burn events. And some of that money will go to helping to do field certifications for certified burn managers, because our certified burn manager program includes 3 components, basically. You have to have some prior experience burning, so it's not for entry-level purposes. And then once you've had that experience, you take the training, which is 3-day, 8-hour-a-day training. And then once you've completed that, you take an exam. And if you pass the exam, you get a field certification book, and you complete that. You give that to ODF and pay a $50 fee, and you get an ID card that certifies you with some limited liability protection. So there's, you know, people ask, well, what are the benefits? What's the incentive? Because some people have been burning without doing any of this, right? And so one is just getting everybody on the same page about the laws, rules, and regulations. So it is a risk reduction practice to do training and certification, regardless of anything else. But secondly, you get limited liability protection from civil damages. So it doesn't protect you from suppression liability. If you start a wildfire and ODF has to respond, they're obliged to collect on that. And we, I should say, we're obliged to collect on that. We there's a few states that have figured that one out and reduced that, but most states still carry a suppression liability, even when they have gross negligence laws, like Florida, for example. So, but even I think probably more significant for a lot of people is that another bill got passed this year, which is the liability pilot. It's a $5 million pool of money that if you get into a situation where you're being sued or somebody's trying to come after you for damages, that you can, if you followed a burn plan, used a certified burn manager or a cultural fire practitioner as defined in the bill. And you know, there's basically it's just checking the boxes in the burn plan, and it's really about that. And you had a permit and ODF approved it and everything else, then you can use some of that fund to pay for damages to avoid an insurance claim. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that insurance companies are pretty nervous about insuring for prescribed fire, because they kind of think of it as similar to wildfire, even though they're very different in the way they're conducted. And so we're somewhat trying to buy their favor to get them back to the table through that, and then somewhat trying to build the confidence and comfort of folks who want to do prescribed fire, so they'll do more of it because they have something to back them up. Because most folks you talk to, they do get around to that. Well, what if, you know, and they want to know. And some are like, you know, that's pretty unusual, rare event, unlikely. I'm good with it. And others are like, no way. And you can really see that play out with the recent change with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's policy, where they now require landowners, because they do quite a bit of burning on private lands that are not owned by the Fish and Wildlife Service. They now are requiring all these private landowners to sign a hold harmless clause, which means that they let the Fish and Wildlife Service off the hook for anything that happens. And most of these landowners are like, no thanks, because they're not the ones running the burn. I don't really blame them, honestly. So yeah, that's the landscape we're dealing with there. But yeah, my job with ODF is basically to administer the Certified Burn Manager program, work on policy and legislative concepts with our partners, and really help our folks try to become more prescribed fire practitioners. It's important to remember that ODF has a mission to put fires out. And so we don't just have a bunch of money, like we have to find funding streams and figure out creative ways to do that work. And we cannot do it at the expense of the work of firefighting. So, it's not quite the same as some of the other entities out there that do land management work. I mean, we're also not primarily involved in the business of land management. We're more providing a service to landowners. And so we have to answer that. And till landowners are saying, we want more burning, that's what they really want, they're not asking for that. They say, protect our land from wildfire. And I understood why, because we're talking like timber value in a lot of cases, it's pretty high. They don't want to see that burned up, and they're paying us to protect it, right? And we can have all kinds of talks about firefighting versus prescribed burning is the best way to take care of those resources, right? But we're not there right now with most of the general public folks who own those kinds of lands. But in dry forest on the east side of the state, we're seeing more private timber companies reaching out and trying to find ways to get prescribed fire on their lands, because they know they've now seen what happened at in the Boot Lake fire at the Nature Conservancy and some other properties out there, where they show just, it's like night and day when these wildfires hit these prescribed fire treated areas. Now there's different kinds of treatments combined, different thinning and age classes and intensities of prescribed fire treatments, but overall that's being pretty clearly made a case for. And so those timber companies are getting on board. West Side Oregon is a little different, because we have a different fire. Well, we think we have a different fire regime. We're showing that we had a lot more fire here historically through some very good research that's coming out of OSU. Doing tree ring evaluations and looking at the dendrochronological records, and realizing that it's mostly from indigenous fire. And so that was underaccounted for historically. So that's kind of led to more of a narrative around long periods without disturbance, which probably is true to some extent, because the fire effects were probably not there, in some cases very hard to record because they were not substantial. But yeah, anyways, I digress. My point being, in my position with ODF, yeah, I'm basically doing the work I was telling the state they're supposed to be doing for a while. And I was partially like, I want to make sure that program goes really well. And it was important to me enough that I thought, I'm gonna see about doing that myself. It's been a really good move for me. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, it was it's neat how the things in your life play toward these unknown and not end states, because you're not at the end of this story, but yeah, just the confluence of things that have come together to prepare you to do this is pretty cool. What do you, and you touched about this a little bit, but what do you really enjoy about the work that you do?
Well, I mean, of course I enjoy the burning itself the most. To me, it's just, that's a given, but I don't get to do as much of that as I used to. And so what I'm finding is actually getting people that are kind of unusual suspects excited about prescribed fire is probably one of my favorite things to do. Sorry guys, it's not you in this group, but it's the people because especially journalists, because I get asked to do a lot of interviews and be a shepherd for the media. And so one of my favorite things to do is earned media work, which means they contact me about something, or two ways it can happen. One is it's just like, you go to them, you're like, I've got this great story, let's do it. Or the other is they come to me about something and they want to do this story. I'm like, that'd be cool, but what about this? And that recently happened. It was a really fun opportunity because they were, I don't know what they were going to focus on exactly. But we went out on the burn. The photographer he said he'd been out on so many burns that he'd never gotten that close because I brought him Nomex and took, you got to prepare it. If you can get banana suits, that's the way to go, because then they don't have to change their clothes. They don't want to change. They're like office people. So get them Nomex. Banana suits are the best, and get them right up on that fire, and so they can really see and tell them exactly what's going on in very straightforward, plain terms. And you never know what you're going to get quoted on. And as you can tell, I can talk. And some of the things that come out of my mouth, I'm like, oh, the toothpaste tube. I wish I could put it back in. You know that analogy? You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. That's why you're supposed to be careful about what you say. All right. So I'm just admitting sometimes it's like, oh, there it goes. Okay, I'm going to deal with the consequences. But in the media realm, that can be like, oh, that's the thing that everybody sees now all of a sudden. And it becomes part of your reputation and the record and everything else. And so what happened was these journals, there was a local story that people were starting to burn early. It was like early season. It was rip and fire season still. We were just out of the woods, but we hadn't gotten hardly any rain. And there was some smoke coming in from the bedrock fire. And so, we were kind of getting this competing airshed stuff, which happens a lot here in the fall, in the late summer and early fall when we're trying to burn. And I'm in the southern Willamette Valley outside. I'm in Eugene, but we're burning, outside of and sometimes inside of the city limits of Eugene. And so we met at the ODF office. I had my uniform on, and I just answered some questions in front of the office. And then I was like, you want to go on a burn like tomorrow? And she's like, yeah. And I said, cool, let's go. And then, we texted making plans throughout the day, and I got the Nomex arranged for her, and then we met there. And then at first she was like, oh, I want to interview all these people. And I was like, okay, but when the fire's going, we really can't bug these folks. We kind of just need to let them do their thing. And we really did that day because it burned very well. And so hence how they got all this great footage. They were so psyched. And she had spent enough time listening to me and talking to me that by the time she did all the interview, she knew what to pick out. And she nailed it in terms of like very straightforward, plain speak about this is what's happening. Like there was no political angle on it other than like a reminder that the reason that a lot of these landscapes in the Willamette Valley exist is because of indigenous burning. And then a lot of the people there were cultural fire practitioners reclaiming those practices for themselves and their tribes and their cultures. And people were back in there harvesting acorns afterwards and plants and stuff. So it's like a pretty special burn, actually. And it was in like a mature oak stand, really nice. Those burns are just gorgeous here because it's like the sun is still pretty high. It's hot, but they need that. And so they got to see all that. They picked out all the right stuff. And then the story came out, and most of the time I'm like, oh, they had to pick that one. Oh God, I wish I'd keep my mouth shut. And this time I was like, yes. So I kind of like because wasn't my first choice. Like when I became a fire practitioner, I wasn't like, oh yeah, I want to represent this. And the reason I kind of started agreeing to was because I thought, I never see enough women in this work. So I should just make myself available for that. Because I remember like not having enough female mentors. And then it grew from there to, like, oh, I can do communication. I can do fire communications. So I should, keep doing that because that's like really important. If you can relay and explain this stuff to people and help them understand, it's a good work. So there's lots of different kinds of work in fire, and some of it gets blended together in what you do. Another thing I really like doing is mentoring. And it's not like official part of my job, but I always seem to have someone I'm helping out, or I get people to help me too, but I do more helping than I get help. Not because I don't actually need help. Okay. But it's that there's like more women coming up now than there were before me. And so, there's not as many older women to find who can mentor me, but I have found a few and they've helped me a lot. And I guess just in general, like along the lines of mentoring, training, in general, I think is just like super important and fun. And I mean, particularly live fire training, Trex type training. I've done a lot of Trexes and put them on, led them, and every one of them I've got friends for life from. And fire really does bring people together in that way, especially when you're focused on doing something in particular with it together. And then like I wish I got to do this more. Occasionally I get to write something, or I get asked to write something, and I really like writing. I don't make enough time for it. I wish I got to do it more. I don't like the super admin side. I'm not the most highly organized person. But doing these kinds of jobs is kind of good for me because it makes me get better. I mean, like, I'm probably organized compared to a lot of people. I just don't see myself that way, but maybe I am more now because I have this job, because I'm keeping track of a lot of things about all these different people. It's like IQCS, the record system you use for red cards, funnels everything. It's like a one-stop shop for all your information. And I'm kind of maybe like I need something like this. I'm using Excel, I'm organizing this information, but yeah, it's a lot of like back and forth with different people because we're in the midst of certifying people. We've had like 10 people come through our program now. But on that note, when people don't give me all the documentation I need to certify them, I then get to call them and talk to them. And actually, I think my favorite thing about the CBM program is just getting to know the people that are putting in for it, because a lot of them I didn't know about. And that was actually the part I was excited about when we opened up our application period. It's like, who is out there in the woodwork doing fire under the radar that now wants to be legit, or who's retired? And those are actually also cool people, because they're like, they wanted to keep going, but they couldn't. They retired from the agencies. They have like these insane reports of qualifications, and I'm like, oh my gosh, we don't have to waste this wealth of knowledge in retirement. They get to contribute to teaching the next generation of burners outside the realm they came from. So it's like they can bring in that rigorous federal background into this space it's just not as rigorous. It's not going to be, because we're trying to reach a greater audience than what the federal system reaches in terms of people who want to learn how to lead burns. So yeah. And yeah, getting to form teams like I got to work on with Heather, that the development of the instructional content for certified burn manager was one of the funnest things I've gotten to do in a while.
Mm-hmm.
And so
now we're gonna write a guidebook, right?
I know. I was like, if we have another project we get to work on. So, getting to work on projects with people you really like, who you respect, and you have fun working with, who are also like productive and dedicated, like that's so rewarding. I love it.
Yeah. Well, it can't all be roses and sunshine. So what are some of the things that are challenging about the work that you do?
Okay. Well, I'm working in a very suppression focused organization. I'm the first person they've ever hired to focus on prescribed fire. And it's a government agency. And I just came out of like, I don't know what, 6, 7, 8 years in the nonprofit and academic spaces, both of which move more quickly than government work, so I had to adjust my pace a lot. And at first I was like, what is going to happen to me here? But what's interesting is I've found that I just kind of adjust my work style. So, and that doesn't mean I just slow down. It just means like, if my iron's in the fire are gonna have to sit there longer, then I'll just put more in there, and that works for me. But not too much, I just incrementally add on. I think work-life balance is always a challenge. And I'm a single mom. I have a 4-year-old, and it's like there's a lot, but that's part of why I love my job, because I have such a supportive work environment around being a parent. And I take my kid on prescribed burns. Actually, you're gonna love this. This morning, my kid said, "Mama, can we go on a prescribed burn today?" And it's raining outside. We're in the middle of the atmospheric river, and I said, "No, honey, we can't do that. I don't know. I mean, there's probably some pile burns happening somewhere, but." And he's like, "Why not?" "Well, things not burn today." I said, "Honey, things won't burn today." It was like so sad telling my son, "No, we can't go on a prescribed burn. Things won't burn today." But yeah, so there's a challenge when things won't burn. That's always a challenge. Um, yeah, I mean, like I honestly, I've had a lot more challenges in the past than I'm currently experiencing. So that's a huge blessing for me right now. I'd say in the past, my biggest challenges have been around, let's see, kind of balancing like I have a lot of drive and ambition, and sometimes I've gotten like in trouble for being like not mindful about communicating, and just being more like considerate and not like focusing on the goal so much. Like I think when you're passionate about something, and it can easily turn into something where you're like, that's what it is. But it's about the people and the relationships, ultimately. If you don't have that figured out, then a lot of times these things don't work. And so, I think I've learned a lot about that over the years, and I've been challenged in the past for sure with some of that stuff, just in understanding those priorities better. Yeah, but I mean, it really has to do with just like we have legislative priorities within our department that we have to fulfill. And so we can't necessarily creatively come up with just things we want to do. We answer to the public. But I have always had a kind of a public service mindset. And that's probably just from, spending the first like 14 years of my career with the Forest Service. I mean, I was detailed out with the BLM for well over a year of that time. And I actually got my first federal job with the BLM, but most of my time was with the Forest Service. And so that trained me pretty well in that regard, but yeah, I think it's really about pace and just adjusting your expectations. Yeah, what else? I mean, I've probably done more talking about being a woman in fire than I ever wanted to. But I suppose that I know I've had some experiences that I wouldn't have had if I were a male. But at the same time, I just haven't found that to be like the space I want to occupy so much, as that really just wanting to focus on prescribed fire, which is what I got into this for. But yeah, there's been times when I'm like, yeah, I pretty much got called assertive as a negative again, because yeah, okay, it's a gender related judgment, but I don't really see myself as fixing that. And I find it better to just, be comfortable with yourself, understand the feedback you're getting, take it with a grain of salt. Sometimes it's good to listen to it and change. I've done that a lot over the years. So, even if it's coming from a source, you're like, oh, I'm not sure about that. There might be a nugget there, right? Yeah. But I mean, God, the prescribed fire environment in general, it's just challenging overall. I mean, there's so many hoops to jump through to get a burn done, if you want to do it by the book and do it right. And it's a challenge, but I think when you do it and repeat it and get grooved and, into it, that it like gets internalized. And I've realized how much I've internalized how overcoming the challenges and barriers to prescribed fire. Listen, I sort of armchair other people's work, and programs. And I'm like, oh, and my brain fires off a lot of different things, and I'm able to maybe get perspective. So I do advisory work, and sometimes, that's kind of getting more back to what I like to do. But if I could be helpful, like, I really like to provide perspective and game out burn windows, figuring out good windows. But that's a challenge, so I think whenever I think about challenges, it's usually about like, what do we do about that? How do we, and then getting to the better place. But some things you're just not going to overcome.
Mm. There's a book I'm listening to right now called The Obstacle is the Way. And it's great. It's a great book because the thing that is in your way is actually the path that you need to take. And as someone who resonates with the things that you have challenged us with, I'm like, all right, what can I do to learn from that?
Yeah. Every time.
That's feedback that I didn't really expect or want. What should I do about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, so now I've got 2 questions here about knowledge, skills, and attitudes. I like to switch out abilities for attitudes because to me that's probably the most important thing, is that I can teach somebody knowledge and skills. Attitudes are the ones that like those are the trickier ones. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, what are the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that you think would be the most helpful for this generation to develop so that they can be successful and happy working in fire and fuels?
Okay, so okay, I think that knowledge is probably what you're going to gain from going to school, or going through trainings, and it's pretty much foundational. And you can choose different paths. I mean, there's so many different ways to get that knowledge at this point. It's a lot better than when I remember beginning my career and wondering if I should go to school as my pathway, or I should just take training through the Forest Service and do apprenticeship programs and things like that. But most knowledge is going to be gained, but some of it's going to be through experience too. But a lot of the knowledge is going to be gained through that more, both experiential and classroom training. And there's just a ton of different ways to get that. When I was going through the University of Idaho Master Natural Resources program, I ended up like having the OSU program get started in the middle of that. And it was like, oh, I could do that there. And they had a fire related component of that too. And so I've just kind of seen those fields grow, and there's just a lot of options there. I think with the skills side, that can be harder in some ways, but it depends on the path you're taking. I mean, if you want to go into suppression, you can get on fire crews and get out, but doing your homework about where you're going and who you're going to work for is pretty important. Every district's different, and I have no idea what that landscape's like anymore, but I remember back when I first started, people talking about where to go to work to get out on fires versus places where you would go and get holed up on the district and never get out, things like that. Because so many of those skills are just about getting an opportunity to practice and repeat and do things. Because fires really, a lot of it's about that. You can't just go do it once or twice. It's a practice. And so skill development is like a practice, whereas I think knowledge is more like I think you should be a continual student. But that's kind of why I said it's more foundational to me. Like it's the kind of thing you need to get in place, and then different things in terms of skills can build off that and sort of complement and work with your knowledge. But attitudes are like, that's sort of a completely different realm in some ways, because it has to do with how you're approaching things, right? And I mean, with prescribed fire, for example, you got to have kind of a particular attitude to do that work. There has to be a bit of grit to work through all those challenges I was identifying. I could just list one after another things that, there's no shortage of reasons to not burn. They're easy to find, they're everywhere, and people use them all the time. And that's why burning doesn't happen very much. So, in that case, the attitude is one of kind of tenacious, kind of, you know, grit, tenacity, alongside that care and good judgment, you know, and then attentiveness to detail. Um, you know, you may have heard of the Swiss cheese model, and it applies very well to prescribed fire in terms of a failure. You know, it fails when those holes start lining up. And so, but the holes are also the things that tell you not to burn. And so you constantly have to do this, you know, and that's a skill too, right? But if you don't have the right attitude, it's harder to develop that skill. If you don't have that kind of like, I'm going to make this happen, even though everything's working against me. And because that's the way that environment works. Prescribed fire is, it's like, it doesn't seem that way, I don't think, until you start getting into it and realizing how many laws work against it, how much it is lumped with things it shouldn't be. It's just the way, for all of it being elevated to the degree that it is as an important practice, it's pretty remarkable how far behind the support it is for it from a legal standpoint. And so if you don't have an attitude of working through all that, then it's hard to develop the skills to be good at it. Yeah, and I mean, fire management work in general, it seems to me like it attracts, you know, almost like a lot of different personalities. But you know, some of the personalities that are drawn to it are more like fire, you know, kind of you know, can surprise you and be fiery, whatever. And then it seems like it also attracts people that are the opposite of it, that are just those very cool, steady cucumbers. And I almost find like the prescribed fire practitioners are almost like a good blend of both of those, because you've got to have that like to get in there and make it happen, but you got to be cool and calm and not get excited when things start, because there's so many times where there's a wind shift or there's some torching or something starts happening, and it can easily freak people out or cause your heart rate to go up and start worrying about what could happen next. And you know, you've got to be able to be sort of heightened and go with that at the same time that you're not overwhelmed by it. And so a lot of that has to do with attitude. Yeah, because you know, when you think about it from the old KSAs, skills and abilities are very similar, and attitude is something that needs to be included there for sure.
I've now heard it described as attitudes, knowledge, and skills, or ask. I'm like, oh, I like that. I like
Cool.
that. What are the
Yeah,
attitudes, knowledge, and skills?
put it up front.
Put it up front. Okay, so similar question, except this time, what are the knowledge, skills, and attitudes, or the attitudes, knowledge, and skills that you've developed in this field that have served you in your in other areas of your life?
Well, I mean, there's no better way to prepare for motherhood, right, Heather?
Yeah.
You know, maybe you have some other ways, but for me, yeah, it's helped me prepare for motherhood a lot, actually. And I mean, I think it's hard to find aspects of my life where I don't benefit, actually. Because just the way I approach so many things is that it's like, how many times have I been on a fire and I did something I hadn't done before, or pushed myself in ways I hadn't, and was like, whoa, I could do that. I mean, we're almost like limited by our own minds in terms of our potential as human beings. We limit ourselves all the time with fear and anxiety and self-consciousness and lack of grounded self-esteem. And so a lot of that, I think a lot of my development into who I am is about, you know, coming up through fire and learning about my own potential that I never knew I had. Yeah, I mean, like I do things all the time that people are like, whoa, you don't look like you could do that. And I'm like, well, I don't dress like a firefighter anymore because I'm hardly ever out there, but it's still in me. And when I hang out, like I had a huge load of wood delivered to my house from an arborist, and he didn't tell me the rounds were going to be like huge. We're West Side Oregon, we grow big trees here. It's not even an old growth. And the only people that come over to help me process this were like other fire people, because they know, oh yeah, chainsaw is cool, let's go, it'll be fun. And I had my neighbors who were like, wow, we couldn't believe you were doing that. It's like we had sledgehammers and metal wedges out, pounding, getting these big rounds split and stuff like that. And I mean, you just think of all the things like that you would do that you wouldn't do if you hadn't been exposed to a world of work that gave you that opportunity to learn that about yourself. And I think too, like, so many times when I was leading burns and something would shift or happen, and I would start to like go, whoa man, what's happening here, and realize like I had the ability to alter my own reaction to the situation. So like that it's kind of an internal steadiness that you can get from that. Yeah, but honestly, motherhood is the biggest one. I mean, just times when I got a lot of inputs going on at one time, and I feel like I can handle them better because I have practice, and that kind of gets back to the skills side, that from practice of managing a lot of things at once, and realizing that it's been more consequential oftentimes, although my child's life isn't any less consequential than anything, but more like moments where things were where you're burning grass like right on the edge of Eugene, and all of a sudden like you wished you'd ordered a pilot car because everybody came to watch, and you're like, or there's going to be an accident and that has nothing to do with your burn, which is also doing really nicely, and maybe burning too hot, that kind of thing puts other things into perspective, I guess. So it makes like what would seem like a big deal, I think that's probably the biggest thing, is it puts into perspective like what's actually a big deal. What do you really need to freak out about? Actually nothing, because like almost nothing's worth freaking out about ever. But you start looking at your broad experience when you've been in fire for a long time, and you're like, oh, that's nothing. Yeah. But yeah, that just kind of that oomph that like can't, I mean, I know it's cheesy, but it's just the can-do attitude that I think I take away from it, that serves me in all of my life. And I mean, it's very particular, but falling trees, like specifically fire week and timber, I really like honed my skills on the fire line, and I use them. Wait, I don't do it. I never do any of that work on the fire line now, and I do a ton of it for my family. So, I've helped manage for like I've done logging after being a firefighter because of how much time I got as a faller and as a felling boss. Working with private fallers gave me a lot of skills in timber felling that I still use.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So final question here. How do you recommend getting a job and being successful in a job with your agency or in this career?
Okay. With my agency, I guess it depends on what kind of work you're looking for. If you're going for working as a stewardship forester or something like that, getting a forestry degree. I mean, when I look at the people coming through ODF, stewardship forestry, they do fire. Most everybody in ODF is doing fire in some way when the time comes. There's a division devoted to fire, and then there's other positions. So it really depends. Like ODF's got, many employees. So, which angle are we looking at? But if you want to work specifically in fire, then You really need to just work your way up. I mean, if you're starting off with having basic firefighter training and such, and you already have some experience, then you may be able to apply for higher level positions. But I think that combination of knowledge through education and skills through practice, and then, I mean, ODF, as far as an organization to work for, an attitude, like it's a really nice family oriented place. I have found people to be kind and open and very good to work with. I don't know what it's like at the district level though. I work out of Salem. But all the districts I've visited and worked with since I've been here have been great. And a lot of people I know like working here. I mean, there's a really good benefits package and pretty good potential upward mobility, a lot of developmental opportunities within. They're known generally as details in the Fed side. We call them developmental rotations. And I think in general, I mean, like I said, I've got a kind of a weird path, it's gone on faith half the time. I mean, when I started and I was in fire and I had finished my philosophy degree, I wasn't sure I wanted to stay in fire. And I put in for law school, I took the LSAT and then didn't do as great as I wanted to. And I'm like, I thought maybe I'd do law school, didn't go that route. Then I put in for Masters of Philosophy. I was going to go do that. And I got into a program, and then I had gotten really hooked in fire then, and I didn't want to give it up. So I decided to not do that. And then, ended up doing a master's in natural resources eventually. So it took me a long time to figure out where I wanted to be. Now, that said, I think it's a very good idea to have an interdisciplinary approach. I mean, if you know you want to do fire and you just want to go all in, there's nothing wrong with that. But I would not discount the fire adjacent, fire complementary things you could do, that don't have to be like philosophy, or I was a music minor too, I mean, I know a guy that used to play violin on the line. So there is that. You could take your fiddle on fires with you. Now, probably could stand to be more of that out there. But yeah, I mean, then it's really, focus on your education. But if you can, swing the whole focus on fire forestry and, the school year, go out on crews during the summer and get that base experience. Just, I think it's important to maybe be aware that temp work and being in school will always be like, not always, but more likely to limit you to some extent in terms of development of quals because you're not around as much. And so that's where, for example, like I had a permanent 18 and 8 job when I did my master's. So I had 8 pay periods off in the winter. And then should I choose to, most of the time I kept working actually, and doing my degree, at night. But then I had I was a fully online student, and my professors were very accommodating. When I was like, I got to do a prescribed burn tomorrow, they were like, please do more of that. That needs to happen. Turn your stuff in late, no problem. I was stoked. It was like, cool. I could prioritize fire, prescribe fire, and get this degree, So if you can, that's one pathway. You want to take that segment of my journey. That makes sense. Like a lot of my journey doesn't make sense, but some of it does, where it's like, oh, you got a fuels tech job with an 18 and 8 appointment. You're on a district that's busy and you're getting your master's at the same time. So you've got like that dual thing. It's a lot to do, but it also took me 3 years. I could have done that master's in 1 year if I just did that, but it took me 3 years to get it done because I worked the whole time. But I'm telling you, every time I had something I learned at school, I was going to work and seeing it. Or like I could go talk to the soil scientists. I'm taking a soils class. I had silviculturists there I could talk to about all I was learning about in my soil. It was so awesome. And when you're working on a district, people can talk. They're going to talk to you about stuff. Like you got all these experts right there. So that made up for the lack of presence at the school for me. So, there's different pathways, but the key is, I see this all the time. People love fire and they study it and study it and study it and study it. And then they get, you know, to their PhD and they have never been on a burn. And you know how many people I've met like that who've never seen fire, who are specializing in it? They know a lot about it and they have no skills. And that's fine if you just want to analyze that problem. But if you actually want to do something about it that's going to hit the ground, I think it's better if you can, like, I mean, I look at people like Susan Pritchard, you know, she does get out there. Like, she came down to Ashland Trek. She was on the burns with us. Like, she gave a talk for us there. And, you know, she's clearly like, she has an idea of what this work takes, even if she hasn't put her, you know, so some element, but decide like what percentage, you know, if you want to be really heavily involved in operations work, don't put as much into the education side. But if you just want to be like a savvy person that's in the research or influencing, you know, things from a different level, but you don't want to, you just, the main thing is like, don't put all your eggs in one basket, you know? And I put my eggs in so many different baskets and now it's worked out, but that's, you know, I'm not saying to do that, but it's like somewhere between what I decided to do or just had happened to me or whatever. And, you know, like, I'm just going to do this. You know, I think finding something in the middle is a good idea. And like, especially with all the Trex events that are out there, like anybody can go do some prescribed fire at this point, as long as you can take some time. Those events are not very expensive. Usually you can get scholarships. It's really just about being able to take the time out of your life to go. And they're just great opportunities to learn outside of getting like actual work on a crew as a firefighter to gain experience. Otherwise, it's stuff like, I guess, volunteering with rural departments and stuff. I mean, I don't know. You just kind of two pathways. You either go learn to burn. As far as how to get a job specializing in prescribed fire, there are more and more of those jobs, but just remember that they, you know, to get like burn boss level requires a certain amount of suppression experience. And so like, but some of them are being flown at, you need a single resource boss, which in the NWCG system that's not a hugely high bar to meet. So, but yeah, the Inflation Reduction Act funding and the Keystone Agreement the Nature Conservancy has entered into with the Forest Service, they're standing up positions. There's a ton of jobs here in Oregon through TNC that are being flown. And some of those are entry level. And a lot of it's like, where are you at? You know, if you're starting young and you've got time to work your way up through those channels, that's great. Some people are, yeah, it's just depending on where you're coming in. But regardless, I think, you know, a diversified approach, but maybe not too diversified. Because again, like, I took a really diversified approach, but I am also very specialized. But a lot of what I've just, it's been luck, you know, for me in a lot of cases, or I've been in the right place, the right time, and, you know, or chosen to go someplace that was good.